Today or not today? That is the question. Hello, everybody. I'm Nick Latrenta, and this is my first official blog in my series of Walking with Creation about young earth creationism. Pardon me, I am walking with creation right now in a park nearby where I live. If you need a little introduction into this series and why it's being done and how it's being done and a little bit about me, please see the introduction video. Please see the written blog as well as the verbal blog. And again, I go into that in the first video of why I'm doing kind of a combo of the two. Okay, so as I mentioned, I have my written blog here, and I'm going to be doing a combination of freestyle talking, so to speak, and reading off the blog itself, particularly for quotes. Okay, so my topic is the word day in Genesis, particularly in the context of Genesis 1. Okay, so from a biblical perspective, I see the context in Genesis 1 as referring to a literal day. And I want to talk about why. So I did some research on this, and I've heard this over the years in various sermons and things like that. But the word day in Hebrew is yom, Y-O-M. Now, I looked up the pronunciation of that word. If I'm pronouncing it wrong, and any of you happen to know Hebrew, or at least that word in Hebrew, please feel free to correct me and let me know how to pronounce it correctly. I always hear it pronounced yam, but when I looked it up, I believe it's a long O sound, yom. So, like in English, this word could mean a bunch of different things depending on the context. So, for example, in my father's day, everyone walked to school. Okay, referring to a time period in the past. I mentioned I'm a father of two. I just got one of my sons into, the older one, into Rugrats. If any of you grew up watching Rugrats or know that show, you'll always hear the grandfather say, "Wow, in my day, we walked 15 miles in the snow without shoes to get to school." So that would be the context of back in my day. I work during the day and not at night, referring to the light day time period. Okay, and it took 6 days for me to finish that project. So that would mean, 6 literal days in the sense of a 24-hour period. Okay, so the same could be said about scripture. And you'll notice in the blog and in the references I have below, I have citations for everything. And I'm citing specifically from something called the Blue Letter Bible by Brown, Driver, and Briggs. From what I understand, they're a very reputable organization that does, translations and commentaries on the Bible. And by the way, I'll be reading from the NIV from all these posts, the New International Version, just for the sake of consistency and everything like that. Bug on me. At least I thought it was a bug. Maybe it was a spider web. Anyway, so an outline you'll see here of the biblical usage of the word day, as in day, time, and year. Okay. One definition could be day as opposed to night. So that would probably be a better definition for it took me 6 days to finish the project. Number 2, it mentions here, day as in a 24-hour period. And as a note, underneath that, as defined by evening and morning in Genesis 1. So these are Hebrew scholars even referencing Genesis 1 as being literal in that context. Could also mean a division of time, days in a lifetime, time period in general, year, temporal references, etc. Okay? But I just find it interesting that the Blue Letter Bible even referenced that as a literal 24-hour time period. Okay? But, okay, that may not necessarily seal the deal. What are some other reasons that I feel that Genesis is referring to a literal 24-hour day? Now, this is more of a personal one than anything else, and I think there's definitely a bug on me there. Goodbye, sir. Part of God's creation, what can I say? Genesis 1 has a lot of repetitive verses, okay, such as evening and morning, which are always associated with the words of day in creation, okay? So to read a few specific ones. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Genesis 1:5. God called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Genesis 1:8. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Genesis 1:3. Pardon me while I turn my page here. Yes, I go old school and use paper. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. Genesis 1:9. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. Genesis 1:23. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Genesis 1:31. Now, observe myself asking for a birthday present. I want a Starbucks gift card. Please get me a Starbucks gift card. I, really could use some extra Starbucks. So maybe for my birthday, do you think you could get me a Starbucks gift card? Hey, I forget if I mentioned it, but, could I have a Starbucks gift card? Okay. So what's the point I'm trying to make here? Whenever we're repetitious about something, it means that we really want people to get the point. All right. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I have a Starbucks obsession. This will be a little tangent here. I actually, for the longest time, never used to drink coffee. It took me until I was 40 years old with 2 kids to finally get into drinking coffee, and I have to add a lot of cream and sugar to it in order for me to like it, because I never liked the bitter taste. I'm obsessed with acai and summer berry refreshers and things like that. That's a whole other thing. But the point I'm trying to make here is, for my 40th birthday, I made it very clear to everybody who would listen that I wanted a Starbucks gift card. And a pattern I notice in Scripture, whenever I feel in Scripture God really wants us to know something, and he obviously wants us to know everything in there, but when something's very repetitive, I kind of find that as almost an in-your-face, I really want to drive this point home. And that's particularly what I noticed in Genesis 1. And there was evening and there was morning, a day. And there was evening and the morning, second day. And there was evening, morning, third day, etc. So evening, morning, number. To me personally, I really feel it's trying to drive the point home. The scriptures are trying to drive the point home that these are literal days. I think if it didn't have that, maybe it wouldn't be the case. Now, I know it doesn't have that for the seventh day. That's kind of a whole other discussion regarding the Sabbath and everything like that. My opinion is, I'm pretty sure the context is enough to indicate that the seventh day is a literal day as well. But that's kind of a whole other talk. So we would call these qualifiers the numbers: evening, morning, number, day. Okay. It all seems to me that the point is being overly driven home. Okay. So counter arguments regarding this. A common counter argument is that the creation days may not be literal. If any of you know who Eric Bischoff is, if you're a big pro wrestling fan like myself, he once said, context is king. And I fully agree with that. Context is necessary, in other words, to understand what it is someone's talking about, okay? So the word day in English and Hebrew could be literal or metaphorical. It does have multiple meanings. However, we get those meanings out of the context. So what about Scripture? 2 Peter 2, verse 8 says, "Dear friends, don't overlook this one fact. With the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day." Okay, so this is a common argument I hear that says, the days in Genesis may not be literal, because of what's said there. And with much respect and love, I find a few issues with that. And I'm going to read something from answersingenesis.org, which is a resource I highly recommend. And I'm going to read it directly because I think that kind of sums up this counter argument. Okay, so the verse states, with the Lord, one day is 1,000 years. So in other words, to God, one day is like 1,000 years, not a literal 1,000 years. Okay, but most people making this argument don't quote the rest of the verse, which states that 1,000 years is like a day. So does that mean whenever 1,000 years is used in scripture, it should be interpreted as one day? Of course not. The context of 2 Peter's passage concerns scoffers who reject the second coming. Knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. That's from 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 4. So in other words, scoffers claim things just go on and that Jesus isn't coming back. The context is the second coming, not Genesis 1. This passage talks about the last days, and we've been in the last days for about 2,000 years since Christ's ministry on earth. So again, that's from Answers in Genesis, specifically from an article, Does the New Testament Prove Long Ages in Genesis by Ken Ham. I'm in full agreement with him with that. Also, and it's interesting because we're talking about taking something literally, but I take Genesis literally. I want to be clear that not everything in the Bible is literal. It depends on the context. So if you're going to take literally 1,000 years are like a day to God and vice versa, then the days of Genesis would amount to 7,000 years. Specifically, the days of creation would be 6,000 years. That doesn't add up to the millions of years argument. Okay, so I know people say, okay, but it says like 1,000 years. So, it could be much longer. Okay, I understand that argument. But I think from what we just read, I don't personally see that way. I think it's trying very hard to show that it's literal. Okay. There are other points made here in the article as well. So I have a link to that article, and I encourage you, if you're interested, to check that out. So additionally, like I said, 1,000 years just doesn't fit into the older scenario. Yum, 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 yum. I like that because it sounds like yum, yum. Hebrew scholars, even non-Christians, also agree that Genesis was written as history and that the days in Genesis were meant to be taken as a literal 24-hour period. So I'm going to quote Oxford Hebrew scholar James Barr. Probably, so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writer of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey their readers the idea that, 1, creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. Number 2, the figures contained in Genesis genealogies provided by simple addition, a chronology from the beginning of the world up to later stages in the biblical story. Pardon me as I turn the page. And 3, Noah's flood was understood to be a worldwide and extinguished all human and animal life except for those in the ark. Okay, so that's from, like I said, James Barr, letter to David C.C. Watton from April 23rd, 1984. Barr, consistent with his neo-Orthodox views, did not believe Genesis, but he understood what the writer clearly intended to be understood. All right, and that's a quote from Is Genesis Poetry / Figurative, a Theological Argument, Polemic, and Thus Not History? Critique of the Framework Hypothesis by Dr. Don Batten, Dr. David Catchpool, Dr. Jonathan D. Sarfati, and Dr. Carl Weifeld. And I have a link to that as well. Okay. So, as I stated in the beginning of the blog here, Blue Letter Bible even uses a 24-hour example of Yom in reference to Genesis 1. So, in addition to that, if we're getting to other references throughout the Bible to Genesis, specifically in Exodus, I believe Exodus referred to Genesis as literal. Otherwise, we'd have one really long work week and one really long Sabbath. For 6 days, work is to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And that's from Exodus 31, verses 15 through 18. Okay, just skipping around here, pardon me. Nice close-up of my mouth there. This is a little awkward. I'm using a selfie stick. Whoa, that was a big bumblebee. I'm using a selfie stick over here. So I probably look a little weird to anybody walking around in the park with me using a selfie stick. But, hey, you know, enjoying it, and hopefully, you know, again, we can create some good conversation and really think about the scriptures, you know, very deeply here. So here's my conclusion. It seems to me personally that no other days in the Bible are as controversial as the days of creation. To the best of my knowledge, no one thinks that the days march around the walls of Jericho, for example, or the 3 days from Good Friday to Resurrection Sunday represent an indefinite amount of time. But we seem to always jump to Genesis for that. It appears to me that this controversy is birthed out of the belief in an old earth and the belief of evolution. And I want to talk about that more in the upcoming blogs. So I'm going to bring this one to a close now, and some questions to think about as we, you know, think about what I said, what I wrote here. Do you think, after hearing all that, does Scripture leave room for the days in Genesis to be interpreted as longer than 24-hour periods? Why or why not? So please tell me what you think. Please feel free to comment. If you're on YouTube, like, subscribe. Hopefully we can engage in some good conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to view or read. Thank you again, and God bless.